The day they laughed at Rowan Mercer was the last mistake Victor Blackwell ever made. It happened in broad daylight, in front of half the town. A powerful man in a pressed suit standing over a kneeling trapper caked in mountain mud, arms wide open like he was performing for a crowd. And the crowd laughed. Every single one of them. What nobody saw, what nobody could have seen, was the number Rowan carried inside his head. A number so large it could swallow Victor's entire empire whole. He stood up, brushed the mud from his knees, and walked away. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The first snow of the season came down sideways. It wasn't the kind of snow that made the mountains look like postcards. It was the bitter, cutting kind. Small pellets of ice mixed with wind that found every gap in your collar, every crack between your boot and your sock. The kind that made horses flatten their ears and lean into walls. By 7 in the morning, Main Street and Iron Ridge looked like a place that had given up on itself. Frozen mud, gray sky pressing low, the smell of coal smoke and livestock mixing in a way that never quite became either one. Rowan Mercer came down out of the mountains that morning the way he always did. Alone, unhurried, with 2 mule loads of trapped furs and no particular expression on his face. He was 38 years old, though he looked older. His coat was elk hide, gone dark with years of weather and wood smoke. His beard had gotten past the point of being a statement and entered the territory of simple neglect. He had a long jaw, a broken nose that had healed crooked, and the kind of hands that made people uncomfortable when they shook them. Too rough, too deliberate, like the hands of something that lived outside. He came to town 6, maybe 7 times a year, sold his furs at Hadley's trading post, bought flour, salt, rifle ammunition, lamp oil, sometimes a book if Hadley had gotten any in from Denver. He didn't stay long. He didn't have people waiting for him, and he wasn't under any illusion that people were glad to see him come. Iron Ridge tolerated Rowan Mercer the way a prosperous household tolerates a stray cat that occasionally appears on the porch, with mild distaste and the vague sense that ignoring it was the most dignified response available. He tied his mules outside Hadley's and went in without looking at anyone. The trading post smelled like tobacco and cured leather and the faint sweet rot of old wood. Pete Hadley was behind the counter, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a flour sack apron and a habit of biting the inside of his cheek when he was thinking. He looked up when Rowan came in, gave a short nod. "Mercer." "Morning, Pete." "Cold one." "Getting colder." That was about the extent of their social relationship. Pete pulled out his ledger. Rowan started untying bundles from the pack saddle he'd brought inside, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything while Pete assessed the furs. There were beaver, marten, 2 fox. A wolf pelt that made Pete raise his eyebrows slightly because it was the largest he'd seen all season, and the hide was flawless. No damage from the trap, no scraping errors. Whoever had prepared it knew exactly what they were doing. "I'll give you $14 for the wolf," Pete said. 18. Pete bit his cheek. 15. 17. Done. Pete wrote the number down. They went through the rest of the pelts the same way. Not unfriendly, not particularly warm, just 2 men completing a transaction. When they finished, Rowan had $63 coming to him, which Pete counted out in a combination of silver and paper currency, placing each bill flat on the counter like he was dealing cards. Rowan bought his supplies. He paid for them. He carried the flour and oil out to the first mule and lashed it down with a practiced efficiency that took about 4 minutes. Then he went back inside for the rest. That was when he saw her. She was at the far end of the counter, talking to Pete in a low, strained voice. Rowan didn't know her name at that point. He'd seen her in town before, the school teacher, he thought, but he hadn't had occasion to speak to her. She was maybe 28, slim, with dark hair pinned up under a gray wool hat that was practical rather than decorative. Her coat was too thin for the weather. Rowan noticed that immediately. The way she was holding herself, shoulders slightly curled inward, not against the cold exactly, but against something. The way people hold themselves when they're trying not to take up too much space. She was holding an envelope. Pete was shaking his head. "I can't extend credit any further, Miss Hart. I'm sorry. I truly am. But I've already gone further than I should have." "I understand," she said. Her voice was steady. Rowan gave her credit for that. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Hadley. I'm asking for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks to arrange. It ain't about wanting to help. Pete looked genuinely uncomfortable, the way people do when they know they're doing something wrong and can't figure out how to stop. It's the terms. My own loan with the bank. It's got provisions. I carry too much uncollected debt, Blackwell can call it. At that name, something in the woman's expression shifted. Not surprise. Something that looked more like the recognition you have when a headache you've been managing all day finally gets worse. Of course, she said quietly. Of course it's the bank. She thanked Pete, and she meant it, which was what got to Rowan, the fact that she thanked the man who'd just turned her down. And she turned to leave. Her eyes passed over Rowan the way most people's eyes passed over Rowan, which was to say they didn't really stop. He almost let her go. He wasn't entirely sure what made him speak. Maybe it was the coat. Maybe it was the envelope she was still holding, which he could now see had the iron-stamped letterhead of First Territorial Bank of Iron Ridge across the top. Maybe it was just the particular quality of the morning, the sideways snow, the way the cold had a way of making small things feel significant. Miss, he said it before he'd fully decided to. She stopped, turned. I couldn't help but hear. He reached into his coat and took out the fold of bills Pete had just given him. He counted out $15, roughly what the remaining balance on the envelope probably was, based on the numbers he'd caught from across the counter, and held it out. Take it. She looked at the money, then at him. Her expression went through several stages that he watched without comment. Confusion, then something like relief that she was clearly fighting, then a careful, measuring suspicion. I don't know you, she said. Rowan Mercer. I trap up on the North Face. I don't need this money for anything that won't wait. Mr. Mercer, I can't. It's not a gift, he said. I'm not giving it to you. Call it a loan if that makes it easier. He set the bills on the counter between them. Pay it back whenever. There's no rush. She stared at the money for a long moment. Pete Hadley had made himself very busy rearranging something behind the counter. Why? She asked. He picked up his remaining supplies with his free hand. Because it's cold out, and that's a thin coat. He walked out before she could argue further. It wasn't a dramatic exit. He nearly knocked his elbow on the doorframe, and he was aware, as he stepped back into the pelting sleet, that he'd just made a decision that probably wasn't strictly rational. He didn't spend much time thinking about it. He loaded the last bundle onto the second mule, double-checked both cinches, and was about to untie the lead rope when he heard the sound of boots on the frozen boardwalk behind him. He turned. Victor Blackwell was standing about 10 feet away, flanked by 2 men Rowan didn't know, but recognized by type immediately. The type that follows wealthy men around because wealthy men find them useful. One was large and soft in the middle. The other was lean with quick eyes and the particular stillness of someone who was used to waiting for instructions. Victor Blackwell was 50 years old and had the appearance of a man who had arranged his entire exterior life to compensate for some interior lack he'd been aware of since childhood. He was always immaculately dressed, this morning in a black coat with an astrakhan collar and a hat that probably cost more than most men in Iron Ridge made in a month. His hair was silver at the temples. His boots were polished despite the weather. He had a wide, handsome face that had once probably been genuinely attractive, before the expression behind it had settled into its current configuration, which was the expression of a man who expects, at all times, to be given exactly what he wants. He was looking at Rowan with that particular brand of contempt that isn't really about the person being looked at. It's about the person doing the looking, needing to have something to look down at. Well, Victor said, if it isn't the mountain hermit. He said it loudly. There were people on the street, a woman with a market basket, 2 men coming out of the saloon across the way, a boy leading a horse. They all stopped. Victor had a way of making people stop. I just watched you give money to Miss Hart. His voice had the practiced projection of a man who'd given speeches at more than a few town meetings. That was quite touching. Rowan said nothing. Tell me something. Victor stepped forward, not quite into arm's reach, but close enough that the act was deliberate. What exactly does a man like you imagine he's doing, giving money to a woman you don't know? He tilted his head slightly, like he was genuinely puzzled. She's in debt to my bank, Mercer. Do you understand that? You give her $15 today, she'll need 15 more next week and 15 the week after. You can't afford to save her. You can barely afford to save yourself. Rowan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the mules. Those are nice boots, he said. Victor blinked. He hadn't expected that. Be ashamed to get mud on them, Rowan said. He clicked his tongue at the mules and started walking. He heard laughter start behind him. Not warm laughter, the nervous, mean kind that people use when someone powerful has set the tone, and they're not sure what happens if they don't join in. He heard Victor's voice above it, carrying the easy authority of a man who had learned long ago that ridicule, properly aimed, was a more efficient instrument of control than violence. Look at him walk away, Victor called after him. That's all a man like that knows how to do. Walk away and pretend he's got some dignity left. Rowan didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He walked to the end of Main Street, turned onto the track that climbed north toward the higher ridges, and kept walking. The mules followed without being told. The snow was still coming sideways. His boots found the familiar rhythm of the mountain path without him having to think about it. He didn't feel angry. He'd gotten past anger about things like that somewhere around his early 30s. What he felt, if he was honest with himself, was tired. Not physically tired, the walk was nothing. Tired in a different way. The kind of tired that comes from watching things happen the way they always happen, seeing the same patterns repeat themselves, and understanding that the patterns will keep repeating until something breaks them. For a long time, he'd told himself that breaking things wasn't his business. He was starting to think the position might need revisiting. Check. The cabin was 3 hours above the town by foot, longer with loaded mules. Rowan knew the path well enough to walk it in complete darkness if he had to, which he sometimes did. The mountain up here had a different quality than the valley. Quieter, harder, less interested in human opinions about it. He'd lived here for 11 years, long enough that the wilderness had stopped feeling like something he was surviving and started feeling like something he was part of. He'd come to the mountains in the first place to get away from something, the way most people who end up in remote places got away from something. In his case, it was a partnership gone crooked in Cheyenne, a man he'd trusted, contracts he'd signed without reading closely enough, and a court proceeding that had cost him everything he'd built in the first 6 years after the war. He'd arrived at Iron Ridge with one horse, a good rifle, and exactly $4.20, which he'd verified by counting it 3 times because he couldn't quite believe how completely a man's life could be reduced. He hadn't planned to stay. He'd planned to trap through one winter, save enough to move on, find somewhere else to start over. But the mountains had changed his plans without consulting him. He'd found that he liked the silence. He liked the work, which was physical and comprehensible in a way that the tangled business dealings in Cheyenne had not been. He liked that the wilderness didn't care who he'd been before he got there. He settled in, and over the first year, he found the silver. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. He wasn't hiking some heroic ridge when the earth opened up and revealed treasure. He was checking a trapline in a side canyon he'd been using to shortcut between 2 higher ridges, and the water coming down the canyon had cut a new channel over the winter, and where it had cut through the rock, the exposure showed a vein. He almost didn't recognize it. He'd had no particular mining knowledge, but he'd grown up near enough to the Colorado silver country to know what certain rock looked like when it had been visited by the geological processes that mattered. He spent 3 weeks assessing it before he told himself it was real. Then he spent another month deciding what to do about it. The problem with finding silver in 1872 was the same as the problem with finding any significant wealth in a landscape where claim jumping was more common than honesty, and where lawyers and financiers had systems in place specifically designed to separate a discoverer from his discovery before he understood what was happening. Rowan had already been stripped once by people who were better at paperwork than he was. He was not going to let it happen again. So he made a decision that most people hearing it would have considered either spectacularly shrewd or completely insane depending on their temperament. He did nothing obvious. He filed no claim. The canyon was on public land, remote, unmarked, and he saw no reason to advertise. He didn't tell anyone. He started mining carefully, slowly, using only hand tools, working alone, taking out what he could carry without attracting attention, and storing it. Beneath the cabin floor under the wooden boards was a root cellar that he'd dug deeper over the years. In the deepest part of it, behind a false wall he'd built himself, was the accumulation of 11 years of quiet, private mining. Not refined silver, but high-grade ore, carefully sorted and cataloged in a system of his own devising. He had good ore and better ore, and he knew the difference, and he knew approximately what it was worth per ton at current prices because he read mining journals the same way he read everything else, carefully, quietly, and without discussing it with people who might find it interesting. The last time he'd calculated the value of what was stored beneath his floor, the number had been somewhere north of $300,000. He hadn't updated that calculation in 2 years. He was fairly certain the number had gotten larger. When he reached the cabin and unloaded the mules and put them in the small lean-to that served as a barn, he built a fire in the iron stove and put water on for coffee. He sat at the rough table he'd made himself from split pine planks, and he thought about Eleanor Hart and her thin coat and her letter from the bank and the way she'd thanked Pete Hadley for saying no. He thought about Victor Blackwell and his Astrakhan collar and his 2 men who stood at angles that implied they were available for purposes beyond simple companionship. He thought about the town below, which he didn't particularly like but which contained people, and the people contained lives. And the lives were being managed by a man who had structured the entire economy of the valley so that its outputs fed continuously upward to him. Rowan understood the system because he'd spent years watching it from above, the way you watch weather patterns from a high ridge, with a certain detachment, but also with the knowledge that the weather doesn't stay up there. Eventually, it comes down. He poured his coffee. It was bitter and too hot, and he drank it anyway. The thing about Victor Blackwell's power, he thought, was that it had a very specific foundation: banks, debt, the legal architecture of obligation. Victor didn't rule through violence, though he didn't seem averse to it when necessary. He ruled through instruments, mortgages, loan agreements, the compound mathematics of interest applied to people who didn't fully understand compound mathematics. He owned the First Territorial Bank of Iron Ridge, and through that bank he held the notes on nearly every significant piece of property in the valley. People were afraid of him because being afraid of the man who held your debt was the most rational economic response available to them. The thing about instruments, Rowan thought, was that they could be picked up by someone else. He sat with that thought for a while. Outside, the snow had stopped. The mountains in the early afternoon had gone quiet in that particular way they did when the sky cleared after a storm. Very still, very cold, with the light going long and flat across the white ridges. He'd spent 11 years telling himself this wasn't his business. He thought about Eleanor Hart's face when she'd looked at those $15 on the counter. Not grateful, exactly. Something more complicated than gratitude. The expression of a person who has been fighting alone for long enough that any offered help arrives wrapped in suspicion because they've learned through experience that nothing comes without a cost they can't afford. She was wrong about his $15, but she wasn't wrong to be suspicious of the world that had produced her situation. He stood up. He went to the corner of the cabin where he kept his good clothes. Not many, but he'd learned enough in the Cheyenne years to know that there were situations where your appearance was the first thing that determined whether you were taken seriously. He had a dark suit, well made if slightly out of fashion, that had been wrapped in oilcloth for the better part of a year. He had a good shirt. He had boots that were different from his working boots, polished, clean. He stood there looking at these clothes for a long time. Then he went to the root cellar. In Iron Ridge, the weeks after Rowan's return to the mountains followed a pattern that had established itself with the grim regularity of a season that refuses to end. Victor Blackwell moved on Eleanor Hart. He had been patient with her. A patience that, as those who knew him understood, had nothing to do with generosity and everything to do with timing. Victor didn't act until he calculated the maximum effect. The proposal had come 3 weeks before Rowan's visit to town, during what Victor had perhaps misjudged as Eleanor's moment of greatest vulnerability. He had arranged to speak with her privately in the office of the bank and had offered what he described as a solution to her difficulties, marriage to him, which would eliminate her debt and provide for her future. She had told him no. She had been calm about it, which was worse than if she'd been emotional. She'd thanked him for the offer and declined it and asked to be shown out. Victor had smiled and shown her out, and then gone back to his desk and opened his ledger and begun the process of making her circumstances considerably more difficult. He accelerated the debt schedule on the note her father had left, adding fees that were technically within the agreement's language, compounding in ways that required a careful reading of the fine print, which Eleanor didn't have, because she'd never had reason to read fine print before her father died. He called in a supplier credit that the school had been running on for months. He had a quiet word with 3 of the town's merchants about their own loan situations and the general importance of not extending Eleanor Hart any credit that might in some way make her less motivated to resolve her primary obligation. Within 6 weeks of that proposal, Eleanor had lost the schoolhouse to the bank's execution of a lien she hadn't known was attached to the property, been evicted from the small house she'd been renting from a man whose mortgage Victor owned, and was sleeping in the back room of May Larkin's boarding house in exchange for doing laundry and cooking breakfasts. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to bed after 9 at night, and spent the hours between teaching the children whose parents still brought them to the borrowed space May had let her use in the boarding house parlor, because she was not going to stop teaching. She was quite clear about that with herself. Victor Blackwell could take the building. He could not take what she knew. She graded papers by candlelight when her hands had stopped aching from the laundry. She kept her books in a trunk under the small cot in the back room. She wrote a long letter to her sister in St. Louis that she never sent because she didn't want her sister to worry. She had bruises under her eyes from not sleeping enough, but she was present every morning at 6:30 when the first child arrived, and she was still the best teacher in the territory, and some mornings that had to be enough. Nobody in Iron Ridge did much about any of this. This was not because the people of Iron Ridge were uniquely cruel. It was because the people of Iron Ridge were scared, which is a different thing, and in some ways worse, because you can't fix scared by appealing to people's decency. You have to change the thing that's scaring them. Thomas Reeves owned the hardware store and had watched Eleanor Hart grade papers through his shop window for 3 consecutive evenings before his wife told him he needed to do something. "What am I supposed to do?" he said. "I don't know, Thomas. Something. You know what Blackwell did to Gareth Simmons when Gareth tried to get the merchants together to push back on those supply fees. His wife knew. Most of the town knew. Gareth Simmons had been in business for 14 years. He'd closed his shop in September, 6 weeks after the incident, and moved his family to Boulder. "It's not right," Thomas Reeves' wife said. "No," Thomas Reeves agreed. "It's not right at all." Neither of them said anything else about it. Dorothea Lane was 70 years old and had lived in the valley since before it had a name, and she was one of the only people in Iron Ridge who wasn't afraid of Victor Blackwell, primarily because she was too old to care what he did to her, and her property was paid for, and she'd lived long enough to know that people like Victor Blackwell eventually ran out of road. She couldn't have explained exactly why she believed this. It was more of a conviction than an argument, but she was confident in it. She brought Eleanor a venison stew every Sunday. She sat with her in May Larkin's back room while Eleanor ate it, and she listened when Eleanor talked, which Eleanor didn't do often, but when she did, it was to Dorothea. "I keep thinking," Eleanor said one evening in late November, setting down the bowl half-eaten because her appetite hadn't been right for weeks, "that if I could just get through to spring, something will change." "What changes in spring?" "I don't know. Something. It has to." Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. "Is this about the mountain man? The one Blackwell embarrassed in the street?" Eleanor's expression did something complicated that she controlled quickly. "No, why would you ask that?" "Because May Larkin told me he left you $15. "He did." "And?" "And nothing. He was being kind. People are sometimes kind." "Not that kind of kind," Dorothea said. $15 is not being polite. $15 is taking something from himself and giving it to someone he doesn't know. Eleanor was quiet. "Do you know who he is?" Dorothea asked. "I know what people say. That he's strange. That he talks to his mules. That he hasn't had a conversation with another person that lasted longer than 5 minutes in a decade." She paused. "I know he has a broken nose and he didn't flinch when Victor was standing over him like that." "He didn't flinch," Dorothea agreed. "That's interesting, isn't it? Men who don't flinch in front of Victor Blackwell are rare." She picked up her own cup of tea. "Usually the ones who don't flinch are the ones who have something they know that Victor doesn't know they know." Eleanor looked at her. "That's an interesting thought," she said carefully. "I'm an interesting woman," Dorothea said. "It is strong," and took a sip of her tea. What nobody in Iron Ridge knew, what nobody could have known, was what was happening in Denver. The offices of Harrison and Cole Assay and Investment were on the 3rd floor of the Tabor building on Larimer Street, which was about as respectable an address as you could have in Denver in 1883 if you wanted serious financial people to take you seriously. James Harrison had been in the mining finance business for 20 years and had seen every variety of prospector, speculator, and outright lunatic that the Rocky Mountain mineral belt could produce. He liked to say that he could tell within 3 minutes of meeting someone whether they had anything real or were just optimistic. He had not been prepared for Rowan Mercer. The man had made an appointment through the mail, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the sample he'd sent along with his letter. A small canvas bag of ore, 6 samples of varying grade, accompanied by a handwritten description of the deposit that was, Harrison told his partner Cole afterward, the most precise and technically accurate self-reported geological assessment he'd received from a private prospector in his entire career. Not because it used fancy language, it didn't, but because it described exactly what was there, what grade it was, and what the likely total yield per ton would be at different extraction points, and every number was within 8% of what Harrison's own man estimated when they sent the samples out for independent assay. "He's been mining alone for 11 years, Harrison said to Cole, reading back over the letter. "No partners, no investors, no filing." "That's insane," Cole said. "Or brilliant, depends on whether he's got what he says he's got." When Rowan arrived in person 3 days later, Harrison's first reaction was visual adjustment. The man standing in his doorway did not fit the letter. He was dressed well. Dark suit, clean, but there was something about him that formal clothing hadn't entirely transformed. Something in the set of the jaw, and the way the hands moved that spoke of years of outdoor physical labor, of a life lived mostly against weather and at altitude. He sat in the chair across from Harrison's desk without fidgeting, without performing the kind of nervous energy that prospectors usually brought into financial offices. He just sat there and looked at Harrison with level gray eyes and waited to be addressed. "Mr. Mercer," Harrison said, "I've reviewed your samples." "I know. You sent them to Bergman for independent assay. I would have done the same thing." Harrison blinked. "How do you—" "Bergman's the best in Denver. It's where I'd send them if I were you." Rowan folded his hands. "What did he say?" Harrison looked down at the report. "High-grade ore, consistent with your description. He's estimating the visible vein at approximately—" "Don't tell me the estimate on the visible vein," Rowan said. "That's not the point. Tell me the grade percentage on sample 4. That's the secondary vein 6 feet below the primary. Most people would have missed it." Harrison found sample 4 on Bergman's report. "Read the number." Looked up. "He says 23%, Harrison said. Rowan nodded once. "I had it at 21. He's probably right. I didn't have access to a proper spectrographic analysis." He paused. "The secondary vein is larger than the primary, about twice the length, and deeper. It doesn't appear on the surface exposure. You'd have to know where to look." Harrison set the report down slowly. In 20 years, he had made a considerable amount of money by remaining calm in front of people and very carefully not showing what he was thinking. He was working harder at that than usual right now. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I need to ask you a question, and I need an honest answer." "All right. Why are you here now? If you've been sitting on this for 11 years, what changed?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. Harrison had the sense that he was not picking the words carefully. He wasn't the kind of man who performed thoughtfulness. He was actually thinking. "There's a woman in the town below my mountain," Rowan said at last. "She's losing everything she has to a man who shouldn't have the power he has. And I decided I'd had enough of watching things happen when I have the means to do something about it." Harrison waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "That's the whole reason," he said. "I've had other reasons coming along behind it for about 4 years, Rowan said. "That one just arrived first." Harrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up, extended his hand across the desk, and when Rowan shook it, he made a mental note of the thing he'd already suspected. The grip was the grip of a man who worked with his hands, but the hand was also steady, and the eyes above the handshake were calm. And James Harrison, who prided himself on reading people, had the strong and sudden conviction that this was the most dangerous transaction he'd entered into in a very long time. Not dangerous to him, dangerous to whoever this man had decided to put himself against. "Sit back down," Harrison said. "We have a great deal to discuss." The meetings took 4 days. On the first day, they established the scope of the holdings and the nature of the ore deposit, working with Harrison's team of assayers and geologists who made the trip up to Rowan's Mountain in a hired wagon and came back 6 hours later looking somewhat stunned. The senior geologist, a German-trained man named Fisher, who had examined deposits on 3 continents, pulled Harrison aside before dinner and said, quietly, that the deposit was real, that it was large, and that the man who'd been sitting on it for 11 years had— and Fisher actually laughed when he said this, the short, involuntary laugh of a professional encountering something that exceeded the bounds of his expectations. He'd been extracting at roughly 60% efficiency using hand tools in one man, which was insane, but the insanity was executed with a methodical precision that made the resulting numbers, frankly, impressive. On the second day, they discussed legal structure, how to formalize the claim, how to protect it, how to begin accessing capital against the proven reserves without triggering the kind of attention from speculators and claim jumpers that Rowan had spent 11 years successfully avoiding. Harrison brought in a lawyer, a careful man named Prescott, who didn't speak much but wrote things down exactly right the first time. They drafted a corporate structure. They established a bank relationship. They began the process that would, within 60 days, make the mountain man nobody had counted a capitalized mining operation with backing from 2 Denver investment houses. On the third day, Rowan explained what he actually wanted to do with the money, and there was a long silence in the room. Harrison broke it. "You want to buy his debt," he said. "All of it, everything he's got paper on in that valley. Do you understand how much—" "I've been studying his holdings for 3 years." Rowan took a folded paper from his coat pocket and set it on the table. It was covered in his small, precise handwriting, names, amounts, dates, lien positions. "That's what I could establish from public records and observation. You'll find more. But that's the shape of it." Harrison looked at the list. He looked at Cole. He looked at Prescott. "This is not," Harrison said carefully, "how people usually deploy capital." "No," Rowan agreed. "Most people in your position, they're thinking about how to build something." "I'm thinking about how to build something," Rowan said. "I need to take something apart first." Prescott spoke for the first time in an hour. "It's legal," he said. "Buying debt is legal. Calling it is legal. There's nothing—" He stopped, tapped his pen on the table. "There's nothing in what you've described that isn't perfectly within the law." "That was the intention," Rowan said. On the 4th day, they signed papers. Rowan walked out of the Tabor building in the afternoon light of a Colorado winter day with a capital line that, if the reserves proved out as Fisher expected them to, would exceed $2 million. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting his hat against the wind off the mountains to the west. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the way he felt at the start of a long trapline, a kind of quiet readiness, the specific alertness of someone who knows the work is about to begin and has no illusions about how much of it there is. He had a lot of debt to buy. He started walking. December arrived and then deepened, and Iron Ridge settled into the blue-cold grip of high winter, which in the mountains meant temperatures that cracked wood and water that froze before it reached the ground, and a kind of enforced stillness that the town wore like a garment it hadn't chosen. Eleanor taught. She woke at 4, made breakfast, did laundry, taught. She read to the children on Friday afternoons, longer texts than the curriculum required, because she discovered that story was the one thing that made the hard winter mornings feel like something other than endurance. She read them Cooper and Twain, and sometimes, when she thought they could handle it, something more demanding, Emerson, whose sentences confused some of them and sharpened others, the way cold air is confusing to people who aren't used to it, but clarifying to people who are. She did not think much about Rowan Mercer. She tried not to. The $15 sat in her mind with a weight that was out of proportion to the amount, the way small kindnesses sometimes do when they arrive in the middle of a long period of unkindness. They become the thing you measure everything else against, which isn't fair to them, but is inevitable. She thought about what Dorothea had said. Men who don't flinch in front of Victor Blackwell are rare. She thought about the way he'd walked away. Not fast, not defiant, just steady. The way a man walks when he knows where he's going and has decided not to be distracted. She put those thoughts away. She had enough difficulty managing the things she could see without making up stories about the things she couldn't. Victor, for his part, had moved on from Eleanor with the casual thoroughness of a man tidying up a completed task. He assumed she would come to him eventually. He assumed everyone came to him eventually, and he had so far not been wrong enough times to correct the assumption. He was very busy with the new supply contracts he was negotiating with the Atchison Railroad, which was extending a spur line into the valley and which represented the kind of opportunity that, if managed correctly, would double his operational reach by spring. He had a dinner in his house every Thursday for the men who mattered in the territory. 2 judges, the county commissioner, 3 mine operators from the lower range. He told good stories and poured good whiskey and was exactly the kind of host who made people feel, briefly, that they were participating in something larger than themselves. He was, in the way of men like him, happy. He had absolutely no idea what was moving toward him. The first sign was subtle enough that Victor nearly dismissed it. His man at First Continental Bank in Denver, a connection he maintained specifically to track significant financial movements that might affect his operations, sent a telegram in the second week of December. It said simply, "Unusual capital formation, new mining concern, Harrison and Cole, recommend inquiry." Victor read it twice. Then he put it in a drawer. Harrison and Cole were solid. If they'd formed a new mining concern, it was either real or they were packaging something to sell quickly. He filed it as interesting and went to his Thursday dinner. The second sign came the following week, in the form of a letter from his lawyer in Denver saying that a representative of something called the Cascade Silver Corporation had made inquiries about the general structure of debt instruments held by private banks in Colorado's smaller valley communities, and asking whether there were legal resources available for purchasing distressed commercial debt portfolios. Victor read this letter more carefully. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had gotten comfortable, which is different, and comfort has a way of softening the instincts that made you in the first place. He wrote back to his Denver lawyer asking for more information about the Cascade Silver Corporation. He expected to wait 2 weeks for a response. He was going to run out of time before then, but he didn't know it yet. He went back to his whiskey and his Thursday dinners and his Astrakhan collar, and outside his window the mountains stood in the winter dark, cold and massive, and completely indifferent to what he expected. High above the valley, in a cabin that was mostly dark because the man who lived there was gone more often than not lately, a root cellar sat beneath a wooden floor, and in the root cellar behind a false wall, the ore was exactly where it had always been, patient and silver and waiting to become something else entirely. The mountain kept its silence. It had learned how from the man who lived on it. The telegram that finally shook Victor Blackwell's confidence arrived on a Thursday morning, which meant it arrived on the worst possible day. A Thursday dinner was scheduled for that evening, and by the time his man from Denver had ridden hard through the pass to deliver the message in person rather than trusting it to the wire, Victor had already had his housekeeper pressing his good shirt. The man's name was Aldous Crane. He was Victor's eyes in Denver. Not a lawyer, not exactly an investigator, but something in the middle. A thin man with a forgettable face who had a talent for being in rooms where things were decided without anyone noticing him. Crane did not ride hard for ordinary news. The fact that he was standing in Victor's office at 10 in the morning with ice still in his beard from the pass said more than whatever was about to come out of his mouth. "Sit down," Victor said, though he was the one who needed to sit. He went behind his desk instead. "Tell me." Crane sat. He took off his hat and held it in both hands, the way people hold things when they need something to do with their fingers. "The Cascade Silver Corporation," he said. "I know the name. It's not a packaging operation. Harrison wasn't selling paper." Crane set his hat on his knee. "Fisher went up into the mountains 3 weeks ago. The whole team, 6 men. They were gone 2 days. Victor was very still. "Which mountains?" "North Face, above Iron Ridge." Crane looked at him steadily. "Mercer's land." The silence in the room lasted about 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than Victor usually allowed silences to last. "Mercer," he said. He said it the way you say a word when you need to hear it out loud to believe it. "The trapper." "He's not a trapper," Crane said. "That's what I came to tell you. He's not. That's not what he is. He's been mining a silver deposit up there for at least 10 years. Fisher's assessment is that it's one of the largest undeveloped deposits in the southern range." He paused. "Harrison has capitalized it. 2 investment houses. The number I heard—" He stopped again, in the way of a man who knows he's about to say something that changes the shape of a room. "The number I heard was $2 million, with reserves possibly above that." Victor Blackwell looked at the wall behind Crane's head. On it hung a framed map of the valley, the land holdings shaded in ink that he'd had a cartographer draw specifically so he could see, at a glance, the extent of what he controlled. His eyes went to the north edge of the map, where the hatching indicating settled territory gave way to the blank white of the high mountain country, which no one had thought to shade because no one had thought it mattered. He walked away from me, Victor said, very quietly, to no one in particular. Sir? In the street, October. He stopped himself. He picked up a pen from his desk and set it down again. When did they file the claim? 3 weeks ago. It's registered with the territorial office. It's legal. It's iron. Crane turned his hat over in his hands. There's something else. Victor looked at him. Prescott, the lawyer Harrison brought in. He's been making inquiries about debt instruments, specifically, Crane took a breath, specifically about the structure and transferability of private bank debt in small valley communities. The pen Victor had set down rolled to the edge of the desk. Neither of them moved to catch it. It fell. He's going to buy my paper, Victor said. That's what it looks like. Can he? Victor started, then stopped, because he already knew the answer. He'd built his operation on the legal transferability of debt instruments. He'd purchased debt himself, 3 times, from other institutions when it suited him. There was nothing in the law, nothing he'd ever advocated for, nothing he'd ever needed before this moment, that prevented exactly what Crane was describing. How much has he moved already? I don't know, that's what I couldn't find out. Prescott's good. They're moving through intermediaries. Crane finally put his hat back on his head, which seemed to cost him something. I think you need to move fast. Victor sat for a long time after Crane left. The Thursday dinner happened that evening. He went through it on instinct, pouring whiskey and telling stories, his face doing the right things while his mind was somewhere else entirely. The county commissioner laughed at a joke Victor made, and Victor laughed with him and had no memory 5 seconds later of what either of them had said. After the guests left, he sat alone in his study with a glass he didn't drink and looked at that map on the wall. He was not frightened yet. Fear required a more complete picture than he currently had. What he felt was something that, if he'd been more honest with himself, he might have recognized as the specific, cold discomfort of a man who has spent years being underestimated by others and has just discovered that he has done the same thing to someone else. He thought about October, the mud on those knees, the way the town had laughed on cue, the way they always did, because that was what people did when Victor Blackwell set the tone. He thought about the gray eyes that had looked at him without flinching and then looked away, as if the entire performance wasn't worth the energy of a reaction. Tell me something. What exactly does a man like you imagine he's doing? He picked up the glass and finally drank. In 11 years of watching that man come down the mountain 6 times a year, nobody in Iron Ridge, not Victor, not Crane, not any of the 2 judges or the county commissioner or the 3 mine operators who drank his good whiskey on Thursday evenings, had ever thought to wonder what was up there. That was, Victor now understood, a very expensive failure of curiosity. The question was what to do about it, and how fast. He wrote 4 letters that night. 1 to his Denver lawyer instructing him to identify every debt instrument that might be approaching transferability and to apply whatever legal delay mechanisms were available. 1 to the Territorial Land Office raising procedural questions about the Cascade Silver filing. 1 to a man in Pueblo whose specific professional skill set Victor had found useful on 2 previous occasions, and who did not need the situation explained in detail, only the name and the location. The 4th letter he addressed, after a long pause, to Eleanor Hart. He sealed it, set it aside, and went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he had not built what he'd built by sleeping well when things got complicated. He'd built it by moving faster than the people who surprised him expected him to move. He intended to move very fast. Eleanor found the letter under the boarding house door on Friday morning, between the time she got up to start the breakfast fire and the time May Larkin came down to start her day. It was sealed with the bank's iron stamp. She recognized it before she picked it up, the way you recognize a headache by the particular quality of the pressure behind your eyes. She held it for a moment before opening it, out in the cold hallway with her coat not yet on. The kind of moment where you know what's inside hasn't changed just because you're delaying. She was wrong about what was inside. It was not a notice. It was a letter, handwritten, in Victor Blackwell's precise slanted script, which she recognized from the contract she'd signed with him 18 months ago. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed regret for the difficulties of the preceding months in language that was so carefully constructed as to avoid admitting any responsibility for causing those difficulties, that it achieved a kind of linguistic acrobatics she might have admired under different circumstances. The second paragraph suggested that their previous conversation, the proposal, which the letter referred to as a discussion of potential arrangements, had perhaps been poorly timed, and that he would welcome an opportunity to revisit it. The third paragraph said that he had recently become aware of certain financial pressures she was navigating, and that he was in a position to address them immediately and comprehensively, should she be open to a conversation. She read it twice. Then she folded it in half and put it in the pocket of her coat, which she was now putting on because the hallway was cold and the breakfast fire needed starting, and there were 7 children coming at 6:30, and one of them, a boy named Danny Pruitt, had been struggling with long division and needed extra time before the others arrived. She did not respond to the letter. She taught long division to Danny Pruitt with a patience she genuinely felt, which was one of the things about her that the last 18 months had not managed to touch. Dorothea came by at noon, as she sometimes did, and found Eleanor in the parlor with the older children doing geography, pointing at a map of the continent that she'd drawn herself on a large piece of brown paper because the school's maps were in the schoolhouse, which was currently the property of First Territorial Bank. After the children left, Dorothea sat in the chair by the window, and Eleanor sat across from her, and they drank tea that was more hot water than tea because Eleanor wasn't going to ask May for better. "He sent a letter," Eleanor said. Dorothea didn't ask who. "What kind of letter?" "The kind where the words are very polite and the meaning underneath them isn't." "Ah." Dorothea turned her cup in her hands. "And?" "And nothing. I didn't answer it." "Good." Dorothea looked out the window. The street was gray and cold, a horse standing tied to a post across the way, a man in a heavy coat hurrying past with his collar up. "You know something's happening, don't you? Something with the bank." Eleanor looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Gareth Simmons came back to town." She said it like it was significant, which Eleanor knew it was. Gareth Simmons had left after what Victor had done to him, and Gareth Simmons was not the kind of man to come back to a place where he'd been publicly humiliated without a reason. "He spent an hour with Thomas Reeves yesterday, in the back of the hardware store with the door closed." "What were they talking about?" "Nobody knows. But Thomas Reeves came home from work last night and told his wife something that made her cry, and Thomas Reeves's wife doesn't cry at good news." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Dorothea, what are you trying to tell me?" The old woman set down her cup. Her eyes, which were still sharp in ways the rest of her was no longer sharp, found Eleanor's directly. "I'm trying to tell you that something has shifted. I can't tell you what or who because I genuinely don't know. But something in the valley has changed its weight, and when weight shifts in a valley, things that were balanced stop being balanced." She paused. "I'm 70 years old. I've seen it before. Not often. But I know what it feels like." Eleanor thought about Rowan Mercer walking away from Victor Blackwell, with his back straight and his pace unhurried. She thought about the gray eyes, the steadiness of the hands that had put $15 on Pete Hadley's counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. She thought about Dorothea's word. Shifted. She didn't let herself build a story around it. She was too careful for that, and she'd been disappointed too many times. But she kept the word somewhere quiet and went back to her day. Thomas Reeves had cried too, though he'd done it in the barn where his wife wouldn't see, which she did anyway because she always knew where he was. What Gareth Simmons had told him was simple. Someone was buying Victor Blackwell's debt. Not some of it, all of it. The mortgages, the commercial loans, the liens, the deferred payment agreements, all of it was being quietly, systematically, and legally transferred to a new holding entity whose paperwork listed its principal office in Denver and whose attorney of record was a man named Prescott, who had a reputation for being very good and very patient and completely unintimidated by men who wore expensive hats. "Who?" Thomas had asked, and Gareth had shaken his head and said he didn't know. The ownership layers were arranged specifically so that you couldn't see through to the person underneath without a legal process that would take months. What Gareth knew was that Victor was moving to counter it, that there were letters going to lawyers, and that Victor's man, Crane, had ridden to Denver twice in 2 weeks, and that whatever was happening fast. Is it real? Thomas had asked. Can someone actually do that? Just buy it all? Debt is a commodity, Tom. It always has been. Victor's bought debt himself when it suited him. Gareth had looked at the wall of the hardware store's back room, where a calendar from 1881 was still hanging because Thomas hadn't gotten around to taking it down. What makes it unusual is the scale. Whoever this is, they're not picking off one or two instruments. They're going after the whole architecture. Thomas had thought about the word architecture. He'd thought about how the word was exactly right, how Victor's power was a structure, beams and joints and load-bearing walls, and how if the right beam came out, he'd gone home and told his wife, and she had cried because she understood exactly what it would mean if it worked, and exactly how bad it would be if it didn't. If someone tries this and it falls apart, she'd said, Victor will make an example of everyone who even smiled about it. I know that. So we don't smile yet. No, Thomas had agreed. Not yet. Victor's man in Pueblo arrived in Iron Ridge on a Wednesday, which nobody would remember until later because he arrived quietly and stayed at the smaller of the two boarding houses on the south end of town rather than the main hotel, and he gave his name as Carter and said he was a surveyor for the railroad, which was plausible enough that Pete Hadley, who heard it secondhand, didn't think about it twice. His actual name was not Carter. Victor had used him before, once in Glenwood and once in a mining dispute outside Silverton, and the arrangement had always been clean and transactional. The man calling himself Carter never asked for specifics. He asked for a name and a location and a timeline and a number, and he provided results that could not be directly traced. He spent his first day in Iron Ridge walking the town at different hours, getting a sense of rhythms, where people were when, what the mountain man's patterns looked like on the days he came to town. He asked a few careful questions in the saloon, framed as idle curiosity from a bored railroad man, and nobody thought much about any of it. On his second evening, he climbed partway up the north trail to assess the approach to Mercer's cabin. He went far enough to see the light in the window and to judge the angles, then turned back. He was methodical. He was not in a hurry. What he didn't know, what Victor didn't know, was that Rowan Mercer had spent 11 years living alone at altitude, and that 11 years of living alone at altitude produces a very specific and finely calibrated sensitivity to anything that doesn't belong in your landscape. He'd noticed the surveyor's boot prints on the trail that second evening before he'd come back inside. The pattern was wrong, too hesitant, stopping and starting in the way that someone unfamiliar with mountain terrain stops and starts, but also with a deliberateness that wasn't the deliberateness of someone struggling with the grade. It was the deliberateness of someone looking. He didn't change his routine that night. He made his fire and ate his supper and read for an hour by lamplight and went to bed. But he left the lamp burning a little longer than usual, positioned in the window where it was visible from below, and he slept with his rifle leaning against the wall at arm's reach rather than on the rack above the door, which was where he normally kept it. He'd dealt with claim jumpers before, twice in the first 3 years after he'd found the deposit, before he'd become confident enough in his concealment that they'd stopped coming. He knew what interested attention looked like, and he knew the difference between a man who was curious and a man who had been given a job. The man on the trail had been given a job. The question was by whom, though Rowan had a working theory about that. He lay in the dark and listened to the mountain and thought about the timing. He was perhaps 3 weeks away from the point where enough of Victor's dead instruments had been transferred that the position would be unassailable. 3 weeks was long enough for things to go wrong. He thought about Harrison, who was good. He thought about Prescott, who was better. He thought about Eleanor Hart teaching long division to a boy at 6 in the morning in the back of a boarding house, which Dorothea Lane had mentioned in a letter she'd sent him. He'd had Prescott pass her his address, because he'd thought Dorothea Lane was the kind of woman who might find it useful to have a way to communicate. She'd written 3 times. Her letters were very short and very precise, and gave him exactly the information he needed without editorializing, because Dorothea Lane had a talent for knowing what mattered. He closed his eyes. In the morning, he wrote 2 letters of his own. One to Prescott, telling him to accelerate the remaining transfers by any legal means available and to move the timeline up by 10 days, if at all possible. One to Harrison, asking him to place a specific call on a specific date that would formalize the position and make it public. He also wrote a third letter that he sat with for a long time before deciding to send. It was addressed to Eleanor Hart. It was not like Victor's letter. It was 4 sentences. It said, "My name is Rowan Mercer. We met briefly in October. I want you to know that your situation is being addressed, not by charity, but by justice, and that you don't owe anyone anything for it. I'm sorry it's taken this long." He held it for a while. He was aware that it was inadequate, that 4 sentences were not enough to explain 11 years of silence and the specific circumstances that had finally ended it. But he'd learned a long time ago that the attempt to explain everything was usually a way of avoiding saying the one thing that needed to be said, and the one thing here was simple. You are not alone in this, and you haven't been, even when it must have felt that way. He sent it with the morning mail rider. Then he went back to work. Eleanor read the letter standing in the cold hallway for the second time in 2 weeks, and this time she did not put it in her coat pocket right away. She stood there and read it again, not by charity, but by justice. She turned that phrase over in her mind the way you turn something over to check for damage, looking for the place where the sentiment exceeded the reality, where the promise was softer than the words. She didn't find it. The sentence didn't promise anything specific. It didn't inflate itself with reassurances. It said what it said and no more. She realized, holding her breath. She let it out slowly. She thought about going to Dorothea. She decided against it. Dorothea already knew more than Eleanor had told her, which was either comforting or alarming depending on how you looked at it, and Eleanor needed a few hours to be alone with this before she brought it into a conversation. She put the letter in her coat pocket and went to start the breakfast fire, and while she coaxed the kindling into something sustainable, she thought about the mountain above the valley and the man on it, and what the word justice meant when it came from someone who had been watching, without anyone knowing, for long enough to understand what needed to be done. She thought about Victor's letter, still folded in the same pocket, the careful language that said everything except what it meant. She thought about the difference between those 2 letters as a kind of education in the varieties of human intention, laid out side by side so clearly that she felt almost embarrassed it had taken her this long to see it clearly. The fire caught. She straightened up, put both hands flat on the warm iron of the stove for a moment, just long enough to feel the heat moving through her palms, which were rough now in ways they hadn't been a year ago. She did not know what was coming. She did not know whether Rowan Mercer's whatever it was would work, or whether Victor would find a way to stop it, or what any of it would mean for her specifically. She was too practical, and had been disappointed too recently, to build a castle on 4 sentences from a man she'd exchanged maybe 40 words with. But she also knew the difference between something that was real and something that was performed, and those 4 sentences were real in a way that Victor Blackwell had never once been real about anything in his life. She held on to that. Not as hope, exactly. As information. The children would arrive in 40 minutes. Danny Pruitt was almost there with long division. The older girl, Clara, had written a composition about the mountains that was the best thing Eleanor had read in 6 months and needed to be told so. The breakfast rolls needed turning. Eleanor turned them. Outside, the mountain stood in the early light, massive and ordinary, and utterly unchanged by any of the things happening at its base. The snow on the upper ridges caught the first sun and went briefly gold before the clouds came in from the west and covered it. Somewhere up there, something was already in motion. The stagecoach from Denver arrived in Iron Ridge on the 2nd Tuesday of January, which was unremarkable except for the weather, which had gone briefly mild in the way that Colorado winters sometimes did. A day or 2 of false warmth that made the snow settle and the mud reappear and gave everyone the brief, irrational feeling that the worst was over when it wasn't. The man who stepped down from the coach was not immediately recognizable. That was, in part, intentional. The suit was dark wool, well cut, with a coat over it that had a proper Astrakhan collar, not as expensive as Victor Blackwell's, but close enough that the comparison would occur to anyone who saw both men in the same room. The boots were polished. The hat was the kind of hat that said the person wearing it expected to be taken seriously. He carried a leather case in one hand and set it down on the frozen mud of the main street with the deliberate ease of someone who was not concerned about what the mud did to leather. Pete Hadley saw him from the trading post window and couldn't place him for a full 30 seconds, which bothered him later when he thought about it, because Pete Hadley had an excellent memory for faces. It was the clothes that confused him. The face, when he finally processed it, The broken nose, the jaw, the gray eyes scanning the street with that particular flat attention, Pete recognized, and the recognition hit him like stepping into cold water. "Well," Pete said, to no one, because he was alone in the store. "I'll be." Rowan Mercer picked up his case and walked toward the bank. He did not hurry. He had the same unhurried quality he always had, which in his trapper's coat had read as a man with nowhere to be, and in the dark suit read as something else entirely. A man who had already decided how this was going to end and saw no reason to rush toward something already settled. He passed Thomas Reeves's hardware store. Thomas was in the window, and Thomas saw him, and Thomas put down the wrench he was holding and stood very still watching Rowan walk past. Neither of them nodded. There was something in that non-acknowledgement that was, paradoxically, the most significant communication that had passed between two people on that street in months. He passed May Larkin's boarding house. He did not look at the window, but Eleanor was at the window. She'd been doing her accounts at the table by the glass when the stagecoach came in, out of pure habit looking up at the sound of it the way people who are waiting for something they've told themselves they're not waiting for always look up. And she saw him and went perfectly still. He was 20 feet past the window before she found her breath again. Dorothea Lane, who was sitting in the chair across the table from where Eleanor had been working, looked up from her knitting. She had not looked out the window. She was watching Eleanor's face instead. "He's here," Eleanor said. "Yes," said Dorothea, who had known it was coming, because Prescott had written to her 3 days ago at Rowan's request. The same way he'd written before, the same economy of information, just the date and the time and nothing else. She'd chosen not to tell Eleanor, which was a decision she'd made carefully and was not entirely sure about. "How does he look?" Eleanor turned from the window. Her expression was the one she used when she was processing something she hadn't expected to feel as much as she was feeling it. Like someone completely different and completely the same. Dorothea made a sound that might have been agreement and went back to her knitting. "Should I?" Eleanor started. "No," Dorothea said, not unkindly. "Let him do what he came to do first." Eleanor sat back down. She did not pick up her accounts. She looked at the figures on the page without seeing them and listened to the sound of the street and said nothing more. Outside, Rowan kept walking. The First Territorial Bank of Iron Ridge occupied the most solid building on Main Street, 2 stories of dressed sandstone with the bank's name carved into the lintel above the door, which Victor had commissioned specifically because carved stone communicated permanence, and permanence was the message he most wanted the town to receive. The interior was dark wood and brass fixtures and the particular smell of money, which is not actually the smell of money, but the smell of the paper and ink and leather associated with it, and which Victor had cultivated carefully because it made people feel small in a way that was useful. Rowan pushed the door open and went inside. There were 2 tellers behind the counter, a clerk at a desk near the window, and visible through the glass partition that separated Victor's private office from the main floor, Victor Blackwell himself, sitting at his desk in conversation with a man Rowan didn't know. Victor had his back 3/4 to the partition and didn't look up when the door opened. The teller nearest the door was a young man, 22 or so, with the look of someone who'd gotten the job recently and was still performing the part of bank employee rather than actually being one. He looked at Rowan with the automatic professional attention his position required. "Good morning," he said. "How can I—" He stopped. Something in the man in front of him didn't match the mental category the suit had first suggested, and the young teller was experiencing the slight cognitive disorientation of someone whose first impression is being revised in real time. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here to see Mr. Blackwell," Rowan said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." The teller glanced toward the glass partition. "Mr. Blackwell is in a meeting at present. If you'd like to leave your name, tell him Cascade Silver. He'll see me." The teller went. Rowan stood in the middle of the bank floor and looked at nothing in particular, the leather case in his right hand, his weight distributed the way it always was, even unhurried, patient. The clerk at the window desk had stopped pretending to write and was watching him openly. The second teller had found reasons to be occupied with something on the far side of the counter. 30 seconds later, through the glass, Rowan watched Victor Blackwell's head turn. The man Victor had been meeting with said something. Victor said something back without moving his eyes from the main floor. The other man stood and gathered his papers and left through a side door. Victor sat perfectly still for a moment that stretched about 5 seconds longer than it needed to. Then he stood. He came through the partition door slowly, and Rowan gave him credit for the slowness. It was a conscious performance of composure, and it was well executed. Victor was wearing a charcoal suit with a dark vest, and his posture was exactly right, the posture of a man in his own building who has no reason to be unsettled. His eyes, though. His eyes did the thing that eyes do when you are very good at controlling your expression, but not quite good enough at controlling your eyes. They went to Rowan's face, and then to the leather case, and then back to Rowan's face, and there was in that quick movement the specific quality of a man running calculations. "Mercer," he said. He stopped 6 feet away, not extending a hand, not gesturing toward the office, just stopped. "Blackwell." A pause. Victor's jaw moved slightly, the way jaws do when the mind behind them is deciding between several available responses. "You've had yourself a busy few months. I have." "You might have come to me directly," Victor said. "Before all this," he gestured vaguely, "maneuvering. We could have discussed whatever concerns you had like businessmen." Rowan looked at him. "You wouldn't have discussed it like a businessman. You would have found a way to use the conversation against me." Something shifted in Victor's face. Not anger yet. Anger was still being held back. What came through instead was something more honest, which was the expression of a man being accurately described and knowing it. "You don't know that. I know you well enough." "You don't know me at all." "I know what you did to Eleanor Hart," Rowan said. He said it without heat, which made it land harder than heat would have. "I know what you did to Gareth Simmons. I know the terms you attached to your loans, and I know how you enforce them, and I know what you said to Pete Hadley about her credit." He watched Victor's face. "I've been watching this town for 11 years. You were never watching back." Victor was quiet for a moment. The clerk had stopped even pretending to work. The young teller was standing at the counter with both hands flat on the wood, trying to be invisible. "Is this where you tell me you've ruined me?" Victor asked. His voice was controlled. Impressively controlled, Rowan thought, for what the man was currently processing. "This is where I show you some paperwork." Rowan set the case on the nearest desk, the clerk's desk, whose occupant stepped backward without being asked, and opened it. He took out a sheaf of documents and held them out. Victor did not reach for them immediately. He looked at them the way you look at something you know is going to be bad but haven't yet confirmed how bad. Then he reached out and took them. He read in silence. Rowan watched him read. He'd learned a long time ago that the most information you get from a person comes in the moments when they don't know they're being observed. And right now, Victor Blackwell didn't have the spare attention to manage his expression while also processing what was in front of him. So Rowan watched the face and saw the sequence move through it. Disbelief first, the instinctive resistance to information that is too large to immediately accept, then a careful second reading as the disbelief lost its footing, then something tighter and colder as the numbers became real, as the signatures became real, as the sheer coverage of what had been transferred became real. Every major commercial loan in the valley, 12 residential mortgages, the lien on the schoolhouse property, the supplier credit instruments, the deferred payment agreements Victor had structured with the 3 largest ranches in the watershed, the leveraged position on the mill. All of it transferred cleanly through layers of legal intermediaries to a holding entity that Prescott had constructed specifically to be unassailable under territorial law, and all of it now assigned to the Cascade Silver Corporation, whose principal shareholder, listed on page 7 of the documents Victor was now turning to with a hand that was, Rowan noticed, not entirely steady, was Rowan James Mercer of Iron Ridge, Colorado. Victor lowered the papers. He looked at Rowan across the desk. Rowan waited. "How long have you been planning this?" Victor asked. The performance of composure was still there, but thinner now. "Specifically, since October." Rowan took the documents back, squared them, returned them to the case. "In general terms, a while longer. You can't call all of this simultaneously. The legal process, I'm not calling any of it simultaneously," Rowan said. "That's not the point." He closed the case. "The point is that I can, which means the town is no longer operating under your terms. It's operating under mine." He looked at Victor steadily. "And my terms are different." Victor put both hands on the desk. It was not quite leaning. It was the posture of a man deciding whether leaning would communicate weakness or not. What do you want? Is this about the woman? This is about everything, Rowan said. Miss Hart is one part of everything. Name a number, Victor said. The mask was slipping now, the businessman dissolving into something more naked underneath. Everything has a number. You know that as well as I do. I do know that, Rowan said. Your number is 0, Victor. That's what I'm prepared to offer you. Walk out of this bank today with the clothes on your back, and I'll give you 60 days to arrange your personal affairs before the new ownership structure takes effect publicly. You'll have enough to leave the territory and start something modest somewhere else. He paused. That's the number. The silence in the bank was total. Outside, a cart went by on the street. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticked. You're taking everything I've built, Victor said, very quietly. You built it on other people's inability to fight back, Rowan said. I'm not taking anything that was really yours. Something finally broke through Victor's composure, and it wasn't what Rowan expected. It wasn't rage or argument or the threat he'd been half braced for. It was something smaller and uglier, a kind of stunned incomprehension, the look of a man who has arranged his entire internal world around the belief that he was untouchable and is now sitting with the concrete evidence that he was not. He looked in that moment smaller than Rowan had ever seen a man look in a room. You were a nobody, Victor said. Not as an accusation, almost as if he was talking to himself, trying to reconcile two pieces of information that didn't fit together. You were nobody. You came down that mountain 6 times a year and nobody looked twice at you. I know, Rowan said. That was your advantage. Yes. Victor set the papers down on the desk. He straightened up. He adjusted his vest, a reflexive, habitual gesture, the armor of appearance reasserting itself even when the situation it was meant to manage was gone. I'll need more than 60 days. 90, Rowan said. That's the limit. Victor looked at the far wall, at the carved wood and the brass and the dark gleam of everything he'd spent 20 years accumulating. And if I contest it? Prescott has been doing this for 20 years. The position is clean. Rowan picked up his case. You could spend 2 years and considerable money trying to find a flaw in it. You won't find one. And while you're looking, the position becomes public and you don't even have the option I'm offering you now. Another long silence. Get out of my bank, Victor said, quietly, but with a shaking quality underneath it that was not quite controlled. Rowan nodded once. He walked to the door. He opened it, and the cold January air came in. He turned back, not all the way, just enough. It was your town for a long time, he said. Nobody's disputing that. He stepped out. The door closed behind him. In the bank, nobody moved for a moment. The clerk was looking at his desk. The young teller was looking at the counter. Victor Blackwell stood behind the desk with both hands on the wood and looked at the door that had just closed and breathed slowly through his nose. Then he turned and went back into his office and shut the glass partition door. Through the glass, the clerk saw him sit down, sit very still. Then slowly open his desk drawer and take out a sheet of paper. The clerk and the teller exchanged a look. Then they both went back to their work, each one privately understanding that the shape of things in Iron Ridge had changed in the last 15 minutes, in ways that were going to take some time to fully understand. Outside, Rowan was walking back down Main Street. He was not performing anything. He was not lifting his chin or straightening his back for effect. He walked the way he always walked, the same pace, the same economy of movement. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He was not entirely sure how he felt. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Something more complicated. The feeling at the end of a thing that has taken a long time. When you've been holding it so carefully for so long that when it's finally done, you can't quite release the grip all at once. Something in him was still braced, still waiting. He turned toward May Larkin's boarding house. He'd been putting off this part longer than the rest of it. The confrontation with Victor had the clean structure of a legal proceeding, the scaffolding of documents and positions and precedents. This was different. He didn't have a leather case full of papers for this. He had a broken nose and a second-hand suit and 4 sentences she'd never responded to and no particular confidence that any of it was enough. He knocked on May Larkin's door. May answered it, a small woman in her 60s with alert eyes who looked at him for one appraising second and then stepped aside without a word, which told him that she at least had been informed, probably by Dorothea. "Parlor," May said. "She's expecting you, I think, though she won't admit it." He went in. The parlor was the room Eleanor used for teaching. There were still chalk drawings on the large brown paper map on the wall, the children's version of the continent with its idiosyncratic geography and enthusiastic labeling. There were small desks pushed to one side that weren't quite desks, just boards laid across chairs. It smelled like chalk and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the breakfast rolls that Eleanor made at 4 in the morning. Eleanor was standing by the window. She turned when he came in. He'd been prepared for several versions of this. For coolness, for polite distance, for the careful self-protection of a woman who'd learned not to trust easily. What he was not entirely prepared for was the way she looked at him, which was directly the way she'd looked at Pete Hadley when she'd thanked him for saying no, fully present, with nothing hidden behind the expression. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Hart!" He stopped in the middle of the room. He was holding the case at his side, and he became aware that holding it was something to do with his hands, and he set it down. "I just came from the bank." "I know." She paused. "Dorothea told me what was happening. Most of it." "Most of it?" "She told me about the silver, about Denver, about what you've been—" She stopped, started again. "She told me the broad shape of it." He nodded. He was not a man who filled silences for the sake of filling them, and he let this one run its natural length while he figured out what needed to be said. "The schoolhouse is yours," he said. "The lien is dissolved. I'll have Prescott draw up the documentation. It should be clean within the week." He looked at her. No obligation attached. No terms. She looked back at him. Why? The question was simple and direct, and he respected it too much to give it anything less than a straight answer. Because it was taken wrongly, and it should go back. "That's the schoolhouse," she said. "I'm asking about the rest of it. About all of this." She moved her hand slightly, indicating something larger than the room. "You could have come down the mountain and sold your silver and gone somewhere else. You didn't have to—" She stopped again. "You didn't have to put yourself in the middle of this." "No," he agreed. "So why did you?" He looked at the children's map on the wall, at the continent with its enthusiastic labels and its imprecise coastlines. Then he looked back at her. "Because I watched you thank Pete Hadley for telling you no," he said. "And I thought, a person who can do that, who can be gracious to someone who's just let her down in a situation like that, that's not a person who should be ground up by a man like Victor Blackwell." He paused. "And because I've been watching this town run on fear for long enough that I got tired of telling myself it wasn't my problem." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "My father always said that the people who say something isn't their problem are usually the ones who have the most ability to make it their problem." "Your father sounds like he was right." "He was. Occasionally." Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "He was also wrong about a great many things, which is why I'm here rather than in the house I grew up in." Rowan looked at her. "I know. I'm sorry about your father." "You didn't know him." "No, but I know what his debts cost you." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly required by the conversation. Then she looked away, out the window, at the street where the January light was doing its flat midwinter thing, honest and unromantic. "What happens now? With the bank? With Victor?" "He has 90 days to make arrangements. After that, the holdings transfer to new management. Prescott is drawing up a structure that distributes the debt instruments to a community trust. The terms get renegotiated to something reasonable. The properties that were taken by execution get returned to whoever they were taken from, where that's possible." He picked up the case. "It'll take time. It won't be perfectly clean." "Nothing is." "No," he said. "Nothing is." Another silence. This one felt different from the others, less careful, more like the silence between two people who are running out of reasons to be formal. "Your letter," she said. "The one you sent." 4 sentences, he said. "I know it wasn't—" "It was exactly enough," she said. She looked back at him. "I've been getting letters my whole life that said too much and meant very little. 4 sentences that meant what they said was more than enough." He held that. It was the kind of thing that could knock the footing out from under you if you let it, and he was aware of letting it, of standing still in May Larkin's parlor with a second-hand suit and a broken nose and feeling something shift that hadn't shifted in a long time. "I have to go back to Denver," he said. "There are things to finalize, probably another 2 weeks. All right. When I come back—" He stopped. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not particularly good at saying things he'd only half worked out. "When I come back, I'd like to take you to dinner, if that's something you'd want." She looked at him for a moment that stretched exactly long enough to be honest rather than polished. "I think I would want that," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He picked up the case. He walked to the door and stopped, the same way he'd stopped at the bank door, not quite turning all the way back. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "I said that in the letter, but I mean it in a way that—" He stopped again, aware that the sentence wasn't going to find a clean end. "I could have come down the mountain sooner." "Maybe," Eleanor said. "Or maybe you came down exactly when you were supposed to." He left. May Larkin was in the hallway, having absolutely definitely not been listening from 6 feet away, and she looked at the wall with great concentration as Rowan passed, and he had the decency not to acknowledge her. Outside, the January air was sharp and clean. Down the street, Thomas Reeves had come out of the hardware store and was standing on his boardwalk, not quite looking in Rowan's direction. Across the way, 2 men from the saloon had found reasons to be on the porch. Nobody approached him. Nobody said anything. But the street had the particular quality of a street where people are paying attention while pretending not to, and Rowan understood that word traveled fast in small towns, and that what had happened in the bank an hour ago was already halfway through the valley by now. Victor Blackwell was still in his office, still sitting, still working on whatever was on that piece of paper he'd taken from his drawer. Rowan didn't know exactly what was on the paper. He had a reasonable idea. Victor was not the kind of man to accept the terms he'd been offered without testing whether there was another way out first. The letter to Pueblo. The man who called himself Carter, who Rowan had tracked for 2 days, and whose prints he'd noted on the trail, and who had quietly taken the next stage out of town this morning, possibly because certain things had become clear to him about the situation, and possibly because Rowan had found a way to make those things clear with the help of a federal marshal acquaintance of Harrison's who had ridden up quietly from Pueblo 3 days ago and asked a few questions around town that Carter apparently found alarming. Victor had other options. Rowan knew that. The letter to the Territorial Land Office, the procedural challenges, the political connections, the judges who came to Thursday dinners, the county commissioner. These things would have to be managed, and Prescott was already managing them, but they would take time and would not be clean, and anyone who thought this was over because of one meeting in one bank was not paying sufficient attention to the character of the man on the losing side. Rowan had not won yet. He had established a position. That was different. He walked toward the livery to collect his horse, the cold air moving through the street around him. The mountain visible to the north above the roof lines of the town, just the upper ridges, white and still, the same as they always were. He'd lived up there for 11 years, and it had shaped him in ways he was still discovering, most of them useful, and some of them less so. He didn't miss it, exactly. He'd never been given to the kind of sentiment that made you miss the difficulty of something once you were past it. But there was a quality to the altitude, a quality of seeing things from above, of watching the patterns of the valley below without being inside them, that he carried with him, and that had been, in the end, the thing that made all of this possible. You couldn't fight the valley from inside the valley. You had to see it whole. He saw it whole now, laid out around him, the buildings and the muddy street, and the frightened and the brave and the compromised and the decent, all mixed together the way people were always mixed together, and Victor Blackwell's reach spreading through it like root systems through soil, and the slow, careful, methodical work of the last 3 months beginning to pull those roots. He reached the livery. His horse recognized him and pushed against the stall door with its nose in that demanding, affectionate way horses had. He saddled up, settled the case into the saddlebag, and rode out toward the north road. He had a train to catch in Pueblo, and 2 weeks of work still ahead of him. Behind him, Iron Ridge sat in the January light, breathing carefully, like something that had been held tight for a long time and was only beginning to understand that the grip was loosening. The 2 weeks Rowan had estimated turned into 3, which was nobody's fault exactly, and everybody's fault a little. Prescott hit a procedural snag with the Territorial Land Office that required 2 additional filings and 1 in-person hearing. Harrison's second investment house got cold feet about the public disclosure timeline and needed 3 days of renegotiation. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Victor Blackwell's lawyer filed an injunction that was almost certainly going to fail, but had to be formally answered before anything else could move forward. Rowan sat in Prescott's office on the 14th floor of the Tabor building and read the injunction twice. It was, as legal maneuvers went, more impressive than he'd expected. Not strong enough to win, but carefully constructed to cost time, which was the point. Victor was buying himself room. He didn't know yet what he intended to do with the room, but Rowan understood by now that Victor was not going to go quietly, because men like Victor never went quietly. They went loudly, or they went while doing something else, and the question was which it was going to be. "How long does the injunction buy him?" Rowan asked. Prescott looked up from his own copy. "Answered correctly, 2 weeks, maybe 10 days. And if we answer it incorrectly, we won't." Rowan looked at him. "We won't," Prescott said again more flatly, the way he said things when he wanted to be clear that his professional reputation was included in the statement. "All right." Rowan leaned back. The chair creaked. "What's he doing with the 10 days?" Prescott set the injunction down. He picked up his pen and turned it over in his fingers, which was what he did instead of fidgeting. "If I were Victor Blackwell, I'd be contacting every political connection I had to see whether there was a territorial-level challenge possible. Probably there isn't. The claim is clean. The debt transfers are clean. But he has to check." He paused. "And I'd be considering whether there was a non-legal solution." Rowan was quiet. "I'm not telling you what to do," Prescott said carefully. "I'm telling you what I'd be considering." "I know what he's considering," Rowan said. "I've known for a while." He rode back to Iron Ridge 2 days after the injunction was answered, arriving on a gray February afternoon when the temperature had dropped back to what it was supposed to be and the mud had refrozen into ridges that made the main street look like something had plowed through it at speed. He went to the hotel this time rather than the mountain. The cabin was too far and too isolated for what he expected the next few weeks to require. The town had changed in his absence. Not dramatically. Iron Ridge was not a town given to dramatic visible change, but in the way that a room changes when the temperature in it shifts a few degrees. The same furniture, the same walls, but something different about the air. Thomas Reeves stopped him on his way to the hotel. Thomas was a man who chose his moments, and Rowan had noticed this about him. He didn't approach you in front of people. He appeared when there was a natural gap in the foot traffic, which was what he did now, materializing at Rowan's elbow between the telegraph office and the barber shop. "You should know," Thomas said without preamble, "that there are people in this town who want to help, if it comes to that." Rowan looked at him. "Comes to what?" Thomas held his gaze. He was a solid man, Thomas Reeves, the kind who didn't say more than he meant. To whatever Blackwell is planning, because he's planning something. He hasn't left that bank building in 9 days, but his man Crane has been moving, in and out of town, talking to people. He paused. "Not people from around here." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "How many?" "I've counted 6 men I don't recognize who've come into the hardware store in the last week, asking questions about trail access to the North Ridges. I sell nails and lumber and axle grease. Nobody asks a hardware man about trail access unless they want to know what's up there without asking the livery, which is where a normal person would ask. Who else knows about this? About Gitschult, Gareth Simmons, Walt Pruitt, Danny's father. He's a rancher. He's seen the same strangers. May Larkin, Dorothea, obviously." Thomas adjusted the collar of his coat against the cold. "Dorothea says she told you to expect it." "She did." "So," Thomas looked at the street. "What do you need?" Rowan thought about it. He was not accustomed to this, to being on the receiving end of an offer like this, the particular kind of offer that comes from people who have been afraid for a long time and have decided to stop. It required a different response than he'd had to give anyone in a long while. "Nothing right now," he said. "Stay ready. I'll let you know." Thomas nodded once and walked back toward his store. Rowan watched him go, then continued to the hotel. He went to Eleanor first. He went to the hotel, dropped his bag, and then went directly to May Larkin's, which told him something about himself that he didn't examine too closely. She was in the parlor with a single student, a girl of about 12, who was working through something in a composition book with the intense private concentration of a child who gets lost in her own thinking. Eleanor looked up when he came to the door. Whatever she'd been feeling for the last 3 weeks while he was gone, she'd managed it carefully enough that what showed on her face now was simply present, aware, a little cautious. He respected the caution. "You're back," she said. "3 weeks," he said. "I said 2. I'm sorry." Prescott wrote. She set down the paper she'd been reading over. "I know about the injunction. It's been answered. It won't hold." She looked at him for a moment. The girl at the desk had noticed the interruption and gone back to her composition with elaborate disinterest. "But something else is coming," Eleanor said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." She held his eyes. "How bad?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without alarming her more than the situation warranted. He decided that Eleanor Hart had earned the unedited version. "Bad enough that I want you to know about it. I don't want you to be somewhere you're not expecting something." She absorbed that. "The schoolhouse. I want you away from it at night. Stay here at Mays. Don't go back to the schoolhouse building after dark." He paused. "I know you've been doing that, going back to pick up materials, grade papers." She looked at him with an expression that had some exasperation in it. "Have you been watching me?" "I asked Dorothea to watch." "You asked Dorothea?" She stopped. "Of course you did." "She volunteered," he said. "I didn't have to ask hard." Something moved through Eleanor's face that wasn't quite irritation, and wasn't quite the territory adjacent to a smile, but was somewhere between both. "She didn't tell me." "She's very good at that." Eleanor looked out the window. The gray February light fell flat across the frozen street. "What exactly do you think he's going to do?" "I think he hired people to make a problem," Rowan said. "I think the problem is me, primarily, but I think he's not precise enough in his anger right now to be careful about what else gets in the way." She turned back. The exasperation was gone. "And you? Where are you going to be?" "Close," he said. "I'll be close." She looked at him for a long time. The girl at the desk had given up pretending to write and was now openly watching them with the frank curiosity of a 12-year-old who understands that something significant is happening in the room. Eleanor glanced at her. "Clara," she said, "please finish that paragraph." Clara looked down and began writing with visible reluctance. Eleanor looked back at Rowan. She said quietly, "Be careful. That's all. Just be careful." It was such a simple thing to say. He wasn't used to people saying simple, true things to him. He'd been alone long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone say something to him that was purely for his benefit, without agenda or performance. He didn't know what to do with it, except take it at face value. "I will," he said. He left before he said something he hadn't thought through enough. The thing about Victor Blackwell's hired men was that they were competent, but they were working in terrain they didn't know, which was, Rowan reflected, approximately the same disadvantage Victor had operated under the entire time without realizing it. Iron Ridge was Rowan's home ground in a way it had never been for anyone from the outside, and the mountains above it were his in a way that went beyond legal ownership. He'd walked every trail on the North Face in every season for 11 years. He knew which slopes avalanched in February. He knew where the ground was solid and where it was treacherous under the snowpack. He knew, specifically, the 2 viable approach routes to the cabin and the one that looked viable and wasn't. He'd sent word to the federal marshal 3 days before he left Denver. Not an accusation, because he didn't have one yet that would hold legally, but enough information to put a man on the road to Iron Ridge on a general watch basis. The marshal's name was Aldrich, a methodical man from Pueblo who'd worked mining country for 8 years, and who had the useful quality of arriving somewhere and becoming very boring very quickly, the kind of man who sat in a saloon for 4 days and was forgotten by the third. Aldrich was in the saloon now. Rowan had checked. What Rowan did not have was certainty about the timeline. Victor's men had been in the valley for 12 days. That was a long time to be watching without moving, which meant either they were very patient or something was waiting. A signal, a final instruction, a specific condition being waited on. Rowan thought it was the injunction. He thought Victor had been holding the men in place until he knew whether the legal route had any remaining possibility, and now that the answer was no, the conditions for the signal had been met. He spent the day moving. He went to the livery and checked on his horse and had a conversation with the livery owner, Walt Pruitt's brother-in-law, about nothing in particular that lasted long enough for him to establish that two of the unfamiliar horses currently stabled there had been there since the injunction was filed and had been out twice in that period on routes that came back with mountain mud on the legs. He walked the north end of town where the trail started and found boot prints in the compacted snow at the trailhead that were fresh from this morning. They'd been up there, scouting. They were close. He went to Thomas Reeves's back room at 4 in the afternoon. Gareth Simmons was already there, which didn't surprise him. Walt Pruitt arrived 10 minutes later, coming in the back door with snow on his boots. 3 other men came separately. Rowan didn't know all their names but knew their faces, knew they were ranchers and miners from the lower range, men who had their own history with Victor Blackwell's loan book, and who had been waiting, with the specific patience of people who have been angry for a long time, for something to be worth the risk. 7 men in a hardware store back room, sitting on crates and nail barrels. The single lamp turned low. Outside, the February dark was coming in early. "Here's what I know," Rowan said. He told them cleanly, without theatrics. The hired men, the mountain approaches, the timeline. "I'm not asking anyone to do anything illegal. I'm not asking anyone to fight. What I need is people who know this terrain and who can be on specific positions tonight and tomorrow night." He looked around the room. "If nothing happens, you go home and nobody knows you are here. If something happens, I need witnesses. Legally sound witnesses who can put people in positions and describe what they saw to a federal marshal." "Aldrich?" Thomas said. "He's in the saloon. He's aware." Gareth leaned forward on his barrel. He was a big man, Gareth Simmons, with the quality of someone who'd spent 14 years building something and watching it taken and hadn't resolved that experience into anything quiet. "And what are you doing while we're being witnesses?" "I'm at the schoolhouse," Rowan said. The room was quiet for a moment. "Why the schoolhouse?" Walt Pruitt asked. "Because it's the thing he can hurt that isn't me," Rowan said. "And because—" He stopped. He was not going to explain Eleanor Hart to a room of 7 men in a hardware store back room. "Because it's the right place to be." Nobody argued with this, maybe because of the way he'd said it, or maybe because they already understood, which was possible in a town where everyone knew everyone's situation, even when they pretended not to. They dispersed at 5:10, separately, through the back door and into the dark. Rowan went to the hotel, ate something he didn't taste, and put on his work clothes. The elk-hide coat, the heavy boots, the gloves that had a finger free on the right hand. He took his rifle. He sat in the hotel room for 20 minutes in the dark without lighting a lamp, letting his eyes adjust and his mind settle into the specific quiet of waiting, which was something he'd gotten good at in 11 years alone. Waiting without anxiety. Waiting the way a mountain waits. Not for anything in particular, just present, patient, ready to be whatever the moment required. He left at 7 and went the long way around to the schoolhouse, coming at it from the west through the alley between the feed store and the cooperage, moving slowly, checking angles. The building was dark and locked, the way he'd confirmed it would be. Eleanor had her key, and she was at May Larkin's, exactly where he'd asked her to be. He found a position on the east side of the building where the lean-to woodshed gave him cover from 3 directions and a clear view of the street approach and the alley to the north. He settled in. It was a cold night. Not the worst cold he'd sat through on a trapline, but cold enough that he could feel it in the old break in his nose, which always ached first. He breathed slowly. He did not check his rifle compulsively the way men did when they were nervous. He'd checked it at the hotel. It was fine. At 9:30, he heard the first man on the alley. Not clearly. Just the particular compression of sound that a footfall makes in crusted snow when someone is trying to be quiet but isn't quite practiced enough at it. The difference between a man moving naturally and a man trying not to move, which was, ironically, louder in certain conditions. 2 minutes later, a second sound, different direction. The street side. 2 men, which matched what he expected. He watched the corner of the building. He watched the street. He kept his breathing even. He waited. The fire came faster than he'd anticipated, not from the main structure but from the woodpile stacked against the north wall, which was smart because dry wood in February ignited quickly and the building's north side had old caulking that had shrunk in the cold. He saw the light before he heard the crackle, the orange pulse of it brightening the alley, and he was moving before the second pulse. He came around the east corner and his rifle was at his shoulder, and his voice, when he used it, was loud enough to carry the full length of the alley. "Federal Marshal," he said. Not his own name, Aldrich's name, because Aldrich had told him to use it if it came to that it was legally sufficient for a stop. "Don't move." One man ran. The second man turned with something in his hand that was not a gun. It was a second torch, which he hadn't lit yet. And his face in the rising firelight was young, younger than Rowan had expected, 25 at most, with the look of someone who had taken a job and was only now calculating what the job actually required of him. "Put it down," Rowan said. The man put it down. Behind Rowan, there were voices. Thomas Reeves coming from the north approach, Walt Pruitt from the street side, Gareth Simmons moving fast down the alley with the particular velocity of a large man who'd been waiting 12 days to do something and was now doing it. The man who'd run came to a stop against the cooperage fence, where he found two men he didn't know standing between him and any further options. The fire on the woodpile was real and needed addressing. Thomas Reeves was already there with a horse blanket from somewhere, beating at it with the methodical, furious efficiency of a man who owned adjacent property. Walt Pruitt produced a bucket that materialized from the feed store porch, prepared, staged, because these men had thought ahead. The fire was out in 4 minutes. The north wall had some charring. The schoolhouse was standing. Aldrich arrived at 12 minutes, which was, he told Rowan afterward, 3 minutes faster than he'd planned for, because he'd heard the voices from the saloon and moved early. He had a deputy with him who took the two men into custody without particular ceremony, reading them their federal status with the flat, rehearsed delivery of a man who'd done this many times before. Rowan stood at the end of the alley and watched it all happen. His rifle was down. His breath made clouds in the cold. The orange light from two torches that someone had thrown into a snowbank was dying out, hissing. He became aware at some point that Eleanor was there. She was standing at the corner where the alley met the street, wrapped in her coat with her dark hair loose around her shoulders because she hadn't had time to pin it. She had, apparently, heard the noise from May Larkins and come out despite being specifically told not to, which he supposed he should have expected because Eleanor Hart did not take instructions from anyone, including, apparently, him, when she felt she had reason to make her own judgment. She looked at the charring on the schoolhouse wall. She looked at the two men being handled by Aldrich's deputy. She looked at the 5 men standing in the alley with weapons and snow on their boots, and the expressions of people who had done something they hadn't been sure they were capable of and were finding out they were. Then she looked at Rowan. He walked toward her. She met him halfway, which was, he thought, exactly like her. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "I heard a rifle," she said. "I know. Stay inside next time." "Is that going to be a regular instruction?" He looked at her in the cold dark. Her cheeks were red from the temperature and her eyes were sharp and present, and she was the most awake-looking person he'd ever seen in a situation that required being awake. "I hope not," he said. She looked past him at the scorched wall of her schoolhouse. Something moved through her face, not the grief of loss because the building was standing, but the grief of understanding how close it had come. How completely someone had been willing to destroy a thing she'd spent years building inside those walls, over a dispute between two men she hadn't asked to be in the middle of. "He really would have burned it," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "And you knew he would." "I thought he would. I wasn't certain." "That's why you were here." "Yes." She turned back to him. The alley was busy around them. Aldrich talking to Thomas, Gareth Simmons explaining something to the deputy, Walt Pruitt checking the wall with a lantern someone had produced from somewhere. But in the immediate space between Rowan and Eleanor, it was quiet in the way that a space between two specific people can be quiet even when everything around it isn't. "Thank you," she said. Simple. Not performed. The same way she'd thanked Pete Hadley, except this time there was nothing tragic in it. He didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been good at receiving things. He'd gotten better at giving them. The $15, the letters, the legal machinery he'd set in motion over 3 months. But receiving was still something he had to learn. "The dinner," he said finally. "I still owe you a dinner." Something that was genuinely a smile crossed Eleanor's face, tentative and real and a little tired, the smile of a woman who has been through a great deal and finds herself, improbably, standing in a cold alley at 9:30 at night, listening to a mountain man ask her to dinner. "You do," she said. "Tomorrow, if the town's still standing." "It'll be standing," he said. Aldrich appeared at his elbow. "Mercer, I need a statement while it's fresh." Rowan looked at Eleanor. "Go," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He went. Behind him, the men of Iron Ridge stood in the cold February night around a schoolhouse that was still there, assessing damages that were less than they might have been, saying very little to each other because very little needed to be said. In the morning, Aldrich would send the two men to Pueblo for formal charges. In the morning, Aldrich would also want to have a conversation about Victor Blackwell, who had given an instruction that constituted a criminal act regardless of whether he'd been present when it was carried out. That conversation was going to go in one specific direction. Victor didn't know that yet. He was in his house on the south end of town, behind his locked door, waiting for news that wasn't coming. The night was cold and very still, and the mountain above the valley stood in the dark, the way it always stood, unmoved, patient, indifferent to outcomes that humans found world-altering. The same mountain it had always been. The silver in it wasn't going anywhere either. Aldrich arrested Victor Blackwell at 7 in the morning. He did it quietly, which was its own kind of statement. No crowd gathered in front of the bank, no theatrical moment on Main Street. Just two federal men who knocked on the door of Victor's house on the south end of town, while the sky was still gray and the smoke from morning fires was rising straight up in the cold air. Victor answered the door himself, which said something about the state he was in. A man with staff, with resources, with 20 years of carefully maintained distance between himself and anything unpleasant, answering his own door at 7 in the morning in yesterday's clothes. He looked at Aldrich. He looked at the deputy. He looked at the papers in Aldrich's hand. "Conspiracy to commit arson," Aldrich said, "and solicitation, given what your man Carter has been telling us since about 2 this morning." He held out the papers. "You want to read these here or inside?" Victor took the papers. He read them standing in his own doorway in the cold, and his face went through several things while he read, none of them the things he would have permitted his face to do if he'd had any remaining control over the situation. When he was done, he folded them carefully along the original creases. This small, reflexive precision, this insistence on neatness even now, and handed them back. "I'll want my lawyer," he said. "You can send for him from Pueblo," Aldrich said. They let him put on his coat. They did not let him back into the study, which was where Rowan had suggested Aldrich look for the letter to Carter, the actual letter, in Victor's handwriting, which Victor had been too confident and too angry to destroy because men like Victor rarely destroyed the evidence of their own decisions, because men like Victor rarely expected to be in a position where the evidence mattered. The letter was in the desk drawer. Third drawer on the left. Aldrich found it in under 2 minutes. Victor Blackwell walked out of his house between two federal men on a February morning with no audience except May Larkin, who happened to be shaking a rug on her porch, and who stopped shaking it and stood very still watching them pass, and Thomas Reeves, who was opening his hardware store early for reasons that had nothing to do with expecting this and everything to do with it. Thomas watched Victor walk to the federal wagon, and he didn't say anything. He just watched, with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a sight, and is finding that the actual sight is quieter and smaller and more human than the thing he'd been imagining. Victor didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at anything in particular. He got into the wagon with the specific careful dignity of a man determined to maintain his posture when there was nothing else left to maintain. The wagon rolled south toward Pueblo. Iron Ridge watched it go, not as a gathered crowd, but in the way that small towns watch things, through windows and from doorways, individually, each person processing it in the privacy of their own history, with the man being taken away. Rowan was not there to watch it. He'd given his statement to Aldrich at midnight and gone back to the hotel and slept for 5 hours, the first real sleep he'd had in a week. When he woke up, Aldrich was already gone. He found out about the arrest from the hotel proprietor, a man named Grant, who delivered the information with the barely contained energy of someone who had been waiting to tell someone something since the moment they woke up. Rowan ate breakfast. Real breakfast. Eggs, bread, coffee that was actual coffee, and sat at the table by the window and looked at the street and felt, for the first time in months, the specific physical sensation of something releasing in his chest. Not triumph. Not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when you set down a weight you've been carrying so long, you'd forgotten what it felt like not to be carrying it. He sat with that for a while. Then he went to find Eleanor. She was at the schoolhouse. Of course she was at the schoolhouse. She'd been there since before first light, apparently, because the stove was hot, and there were papers spread across 3 of the small desk boards, and the chalk drawings on the brown paper map had been added to. Someone, probably Clara, had labeled a mountain range in the northwest with enthusiastic if geographically inventive specificity. Eleanor was on her knees in front of the north wall, examining the scorched wood from last night, her coat on, her hair pinned up, running her fingers along the char marks the way you assess something to understand the extent of the damage. She heard him come in and looked over her shoulder. "It's structural," she said. "The wall. It's fine, the char is surface. I can have someone look at it. I already had Thomas look at it. He was here at 6. She stood up, brushing her palms on her coat. He said the same thing. Surface damage. He's going to send someone to recaulk the north side when the weather allows. Rowan looked at the wall. The burn marks were real and visible, and in the morning light they had the quality of a statement, evidence of what had been attempted, written into the wood of the building. He wasn't sure whether to be glad they were surface or whether the building would have been better off without the reminder. "Victor was arrested this morning," he said. She turned fully toward him. "I heard. Grant told half the town before 8 o'clock. Carter gave him up. Full statement." She nodded slowly. She wrapped her arms across her chest, not quite a hug, just that self-containing posture people use when they're absorbing something they knew was coming and still needed a moment with. "Is it over?" she asked. Not naively. He could hear that she understood it wasn't a simple question. "The criminal part is over. The legal transfer is complete as of this morning. Prescott filed the final documentation before he left Denver. The injunction is dissolved." He looked at her. "The bank will operate under new management starting next week. The trust structure is set. The debts get renegotiated over the next 60 days. He paused. "It's over." She looked at the scorched wall again, then at the children's map with Clara's mountain range, then at the stove that was putting out a good steady heat in the cold morning. "My father would have loved this," she said. Quiet, without performance. Not the dramatic parts, he wouldn't have loved those. But this, the outcome of it. She looked at him. He believed that institutions could be corrected, that when they became corrupt there was always a mechanism for correction if someone was willing to operate it. Most people thought he was naive. Was he? Sometimes, but not about that. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the room, the small desks, the worn floorboards, the window with its view of the February street, ordinary and plain and belonging entirely to the work of teaching children. He thought about Eleanor at 4 in the morning starting the breakfast fire so she could keep this room going in someone else's boarding house, keeping it going with no guarantee that anyone was going to fix what had been done to her. That kind of persistence was not something you came to easily or held on to without cost. He'd watched it from a distance, and it had moved him in ways he hadn't had the language for at the time. He still wasn't sure he had the language. He had the feeling, though. "About the dinner," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "This morning, I have students in 40 minutes. Not this morning, but soon." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going back up the mountain." She went still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the mining operation is going to require management that isn't possible from a cabin 3 hours above the valley. I mean, the trust structure needs someone local who understands the terrain, not just the legal terrain, the actual ground." He paused. "I mean, I've been living alone for 11 years, and I'm tired of it. And Iron Ridge needs someone willing to put money into its future. And I happen to have money, and I happen to be here." He stopped. He'd said more than he'd planned to say. That was unusual for him. "I'm staying." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her expression had that quality it sometimes had, processing something she hadn't expected to feel as much as she was feeling it, managing it carefully while still letting it show. "You built an entire legal and financial operation to fix what was wrong with this town," she said. "And your reason for staying is that the mining requires local management." "Partly." "What's the other part?" He held her eyes. "You know the other part." She did. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who knows something and is deciding whether to say it or simply let it stand as known between two people. She let it stand. "The dinner," she said finally. "Saturday." "Saturday," he agreed. The first students arrived at 8:15. Danny Pruitt first, as usual, stomping snow off his boots in the doorway with the energy of a 9-year-old who hasn't yet learned to moderate his own momentum. He stopped when he saw Rowan, whom he recognized vaguely as the man from last night's commotion that his father had told him absolutely nothing about. "Are you the mountain man?" Danny asked. "Danny," Eleanor said. "That's what Pa calls him, the mountain man." Rowan looked at the boy. "I live on the mountain. I suppose that's accurate." "Pa says you saved the schoolhouse." "Several people saved the schoolhouse. Your father was one of them." Danny considered this with the seriousness that children apply to information that affects their understanding of their parents. Then he went to his desk and opened his composition book to the long division problems Eleanor had assigned and started working, apparently satisfied. Rowan left before the rest of the students arrived. He had things to do. There was a meeting with Prescott's local representative scheduled for 10 o'clock, and a conversation with the bank's interim manager, a quiet man from Denver whom Harrison had sent down to handle the transition. The bank needed someone to walk it through the first month of new operations, to renegotiate the first round of loan terms, to explain to the people of Iron Ridge what the change in ownership actually meant for them in practical terms. Rowan had been thinking about who could do that. Who in this valley had the combination of patience and precision and genuine investment in the outcome to do it without making it about themselves? He had a candidate. He was going to ask her on Saturday. The weeks that followed were not clean. Rowan had known they wouldn't be, and he'd stopped expecting clean sometime around his mid-30s, when the evidence had become fairly overwhelming that life rarely offered it. There were people in Iron Ridge who didn't trust the new arrangement, who'd been burned enough times that the removal of one bad actor didn't automatically produce faith in a replacement system. And Rowan didn't argue with this, because they weren't wrong to feel it. Trust was not something you were owed just because your intentions were better than your predecessors. It had to be earned at the speed that people were willing to extend it, which varied considerably. Thomas Reeves was cautious but willing. Gareth Simmons came back permanently and reopened his shop, which was a signal that carried more weight than any speech Rowan could have given, because people understood what it cost Gareth to come back, and they understood what coming back meant. Walt Pruitt's ranch loan was renegotiated to terms he could actually meet, and when he shook Prescott's local representative's hand after signing the new agreement, his hand was shaking slightly, which he covered by coughing, and which Rowan noticed from across the room and said nothing about because some things were private. The county commissioner initially made sounds about the political connections, the judges who came to Thursday dinners. One of the judges received a letter from Aldrich's office in Pueblo regarding certain procedural irregularities in 3 cases he'd ruled on in the past 2 years, all of them connected to Victor Blackwell's interests. The judge became less interested in making sounds. The county commissioner followed suit with the particular expediency of elected officials recalibrating toward whoever appears to be winning. Victor's trial was in Pueblo in April. Carter testified in full, in exchange for the reduction of his own charges, and described in methodical detail the instruction he'd received, the amount he'd been paid, and the plan as it had been communicated to him. Victor's lawyer, an expensive man from Denver, the best available, argued that Carter was a compromised witness with every motivation to shift culpability. The jury took 4 hours. The verdict was not a surprise to anyone who'd read the letter Aldrich had found in the 3rd drawer on the left. Victor Blackwell was sentenced to 7 years. He was taken to a federal facility in New Mexico, which was far enough from Colorado that the practical distance matched the psychological one Iron Ridge had needed for a long time. Rowan heard the verdict from Prescott by telegram and sat with it for a while before telling anyone. 7 years felt both too long and too short for everything the number represented, which was probably how it was supposed to feel. Justice is rarely satisfying in the way that fiction makes you expect it to be. It's usually just the least bad available resolution, arrived at messily, and you take it and move forward. He told Eleanor over dinner, not the first Saturday dinner, which had been simple and honest and had lasted 3 hours longer than either of them expected, but several weeks after, when the verdict came in. She listened. She nodded once. "Good," she said. Just that. Then she went back to her food. He found that he loved her for that, for the smallness of the response, the refusal to make a ceremony of it. She'd spent 18 months under the weight of what Victor had done, and she wasn't going to perform the relief of having him convicted, wasn't going to dress it up as more than it was. It was a legal resolution. It was the right outcome. It didn't give her back the year she'd lost, or the father she'd buried, or the nights she'd spent at 4 a.m. starting a fire with rough hands. It just closed the account that needed closing. They had, by then, found a rhythm. It was not without friction. Eleanor had opinions about the trust's loan renegotiation strategy that differed from Prescott's in 2 specific areas, and she turned out to be right about one, and partially right about the other, which Prescott acknowledged with a grace that Rowan respected. Rowan had a habit of disappearing into the mining operation for 3 and 4 days at a stretch, in a way that Eleanor found less endearing than he'd hoped, and she told him so directly, which he preferred to the alternative. He was not easy to know. He'd spent too long alone for the rough edges to have worn off, and some of them probably weren't going to. She was not particularly easy either. She had a stubbornness that had kept her teaching through a winter of grinding difficulty, and that didn't soften just because the difficulty was over. They argued about small things with the unguarded honesty of people who had stopped performing for each other, and that honesty was both harder and more worthwhile than the alternative. The schoolhouse was repaired in March, properly. New caulking on the north wall, a second window added on the east side to improve the light, a proper wood stove to replace the inadequate one that had smoked since Eleanor first took the position. Rowan paid for it, and Eleanor let him, after a conversation about it that took 2 evenings to conclude and ended, not with either of them winning, but with both of them deciding the building mattered more than the argument. In May, the school gained 3 new students, whose families had come into the valley specifically because word had gotten out that Iron Ridge was no longer what it had been. People moved toward the absence of fear the way they moved toward warmth, instinctively, before they'd fully articulated why. The population of the valley began slowly, hesitantly, to grow. A second doctor arrived. A small newspaper started up, run by a young woman from Kansas City who had opinions and was not interested in managing them, which Eleanor found immediately and completely admirable. Gareth Simmons hired 2 men. Thomas Reeves hired 1. The lumber mill, freed from the debt structure that had been quietly strangling it, expanded its operation and began putting timber into houses that people built because they intended to stay. Dorothea Lane turned 71 and remained as sharp as she'd always been, and took considerable private satisfaction in the general direction of things, which she expressed to no one directly, but which informed the quality of her Tuesday morning visits to Eleanor with a contentment that Eleanor recognized and appreciated without requiring it to be explained. On a Saturday in late May, the kind of evening where the light stayed long and warm, and the mountains to the north were green up to their midpoints and only snow above, Rowan asked Eleanor to marry him. He did it badly. He hadn't planned the exact words, and what came out was more statement than question. Something like, "I think we should get married, and I'd like you to consider it seriously," which Eleanor, who had been expecting something like this and was still not entirely prepared for the specific form it took, found so characteristic that she was laughing before she answered. "That might be the least romantic proposal in the history of the territory," she said. "I know." He looked at her with those level gray eyes. "Is that a no?" "It's a yes," she said. "Obviously it's a yes. But I'm going to remember how you did it for a very long time." "I expect you will." They were married in June, in the valley, without ceremony. Just Prescott as a legal witness, Dorothea as the other, and the quiet understanding between 2 people who had both been alone too long and had found, improbably, in the middle of a fight neither of them had asked for, something that was worth staying for. What Rowan learned, in the years after, and it took years because the lessons that matter rarely arrive all at once, was that the silver in the mountain had been a tool, a significant one, a fortunate one, the kind of stroke of geological luck that most people go their whole lives without encountering. But it was still just a tool. What he'd done with the tool, the decision to use it the way he did, rather than the way most people with sudden wealth used sudden wealth, that had been the thing. And even that, the decision, had come from somewhere simpler than strategy or principle. It had come from watching a woman thank a man for letting her down, and from being tired of telling himself that the valley below was someone else's problem. He thought about this sometimes on the mornings when he walked the North Trail. He still walked it, not to the cabin, which he'd eventually sold to a mining family who needed the structure, but part way up, far enough to see the valley laid out below in its fullness, the town, and the river, and the fields, and the road running south toward Pueblo. Far enough to remember what it had looked like from up here when he'd been watching it and not yet part of it. The mountain had kept his secret for 11 years and kept it well. The silver was still coming out of it, slowly, responsibly, in a way that employed 43 men from the valley at wages that Rowan had set by the simple principle of what he'd have wanted to be paid if he were doing the digging. Fisher came twice a year from Denver to assess the progress. Harrison sent cheerful quarterly reports. The money was real, and it was working in the valley in ways you could see, in the school and the mill and the houses, and the newspaper, and the general quality of a place where people had stopped operating from fear. But the mountain itself didn't care about any of that. It was what it had always been, massive, indifferent, older than anything any human in the valley could usefully imagine. It had silver in it because of geological processes that had unfolded over millions of years without reference to human need. It would have silver in it, or not in it, regardless of what Rowan Mercer did with his one life on its slopes. What he'd contributed was the interpretation, the decision that the silver meant something beyond its market value, the choice to let it mean people, community, the specific and unglamorous work of fixing a thing that was broken because you happened to have what it took to fix it and no longer had the patience to pretend you didn't. That was the thing nobody saw when they looked at the story from outside, which was that it wasn't really about the silver. It wasn't really about Victor Blackwell either, who was a type rather than a unique figure, the specific manifestation in Iron Ridge of something that existed wherever people with power decided that other people's desperation was a resource to be exploited. Victor would be replaced eventually, somewhere, by someone else with the same essential character and different specifics, and whatever valley they chose would have to find its own version of a way through. What this particular valley had found was a man who'd been watching from above and finally came down. Eleanor understood this more completely than Rowan did, because she was better than he was at seeing the shape of things. She said it to him once, on one of those long May evenings when the light was gold and the children had gone home, and she was grading papers by the east window of the schoolhouse, the window he'd added, that had better light, and he'd come in at the end of the day the way he'd gotten in the habit of doing. "You know what I think?" she said without looking up from the paper in front of her. "Usually not," he said. "I think you needed this as much as the town did." He sat down in one of the small student chairs, which was too small for him and creaked under his weight. "What do you mean?" She looked up. "You were hiding. Up there." She meant the mountain. "You found something valuable and you hid yourself with it. And I think you stayed hidden longer than you should have because being hidden was easier than deciding what the valuable thing was actually for." She looked at him steadily. "The town needed you to come down. But you needed a reason that was bigger than yourself, something worth coming down for." He sat with that. He thought about the root cellar with its false wall, and the ore in its careful catalogued rows, and the 11 years of solitary winter mornings. He thought about the day in October, the mud on the street, the sound of a town laughing on cue, a woman with a thin coat who thanked someone for letting her down. He thought about that moment when something in him had said enough, not at Victor, not at the town, but at himself. "You might be right," he said. "I'm usually right," Eleanor said, without vanity, just as information. "You're still getting used to that." "I am," he agreed. She looked back at her papers. The lamplight was warm and the schoolhouse smelled like chalk and wood, and the outside air and everything ordinary that goes into a place where people spend their days trying to pass on what they know to people who don't know it yet. Through the window, the street was doing its early evening thing. People heading home, horses being put up, smoke rising from supper fires. Iron Ridge, an ordinary valley town with imperfect people trying to figure out how to live together decently. Nobody had fixed it completely. You couldn't fix a place completely. What you could do was change the conditions. Take out the thing that was poisoning it, replace it with something that gave people room to be their better selves, and then step back and let them be those selves without standing over them. That was all you could do. The rest was up to them. It was, Rowan thought, enough. The mountain outside the window was already going dark at the upper ridges, the snow up there catching the last of the day and giving it back in shades of orange and purple before the dark came down and the whole vast structure of it disappeared into the night sky. By morning, it would be back, exactly where it always was. Some things you could count on. Not many, but some. He reached across and stole Eleanor's coffee, which she'd let go cold. She swatted his hand without looking up. He drank it anyway. Outside, Iron Ridge settled into the evening, breathing easy, the way a place breathes when the weight that's been pressing down on it for years has finally lifted and the people inside it are beginning, cautiously, imperfectly, still half expecting the weight to return, beginning, at last, to breathe deep.